Okay, good. All right, well, welcome. Thanks, īlāÐ, and thank you to the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, as well as the Mediterranean Center. As īlāÐ said, my name is Prejean. I'm a Fulbright postdoctoral scholar here at the University of Haifa, working with Professor Uriel Simonson. Thanks for taking time out of your day, your busy week, to explore some of my ideas for the next 45 minutes. The topic for my presentation today is Islamic law and the interpretive non-Muslim. Hopefully that will become clear to you exactly what that means in the next few minutes. So let us begin. In 2017, the first robot ever was awarded legal status and citizenship in Saudi Arabia. Her name is Sophia. Sophia's role was less about Saudi Arabian legal rights and citizenship than an attempt to construct an image of a technologically advanced archetype of the global citizen. The archetypal citizen symbolizes Saudi Arabia's claim to be a major player on the world's technological and political stages, all the while deflecting attention from any human rights violations committed over the last decades, at least as argued by Rosie Bashir. My presentation today, as with the construction of legal status and citizenship of Sophia, seeks to understand how non-Muslims were legally constructed and how they reveal and how discussions about non-Muslims reveal Muslim ideologies and self-conceptions, and that in the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era in Iraq by the Ḥanbalī school of law. So what are you going to learn today? Today, I hope that you will learn that we can understand Muslim self-conceptions by looking at how Muslims discussed non-Muslims. To give you a bit of a basic background on where we're at and what time period, we're going to be talking about Ibn Ḥanbal, whose legal responses are the source material for today's lecture. Ibn Ḥanbal lived in one of the most exciting times of intercommunal interfaith relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. It was during his lifetime that he saw Baghdad become a prominent economic and social hub with increased proximity between Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, among others. During his lifetime, Baghdad was the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the city was inextricably linked to the daily social, cultural, political, religious, legal, and economic lives of those living in the Eastern Mediterranean and in North Africa, East Africa, and Iran. Baghdad lay at the convergence of trade routes between these regions, and it was a region in which people from all over the Mediterranean world and beyond migrated in search of better fortunes. There, people of diverse ethnicities, religions, and languages interacted on a daily basis, and some came to learn of each other's cultural and intellectual legacies. Ibn Ḥanbal is an interesting character because as a mild ascetic and a renunciant, he kind of inhabited a tension between engaging the world and forsaking it, kind of like a late antique holy man. And he earned a place of special esteem among the many students and scholars who struggled to apply the law, wanted to know more about the law, and to understand the law and the world in a world that seemed to fall short of the ideal. Ibn Ḥanbal's strict devotion to the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad won him the praise of the common people, many of whom saw him as a fearless leader in the face of political overreach, legal diversity, and impious Muslim behavior. He fought against the theological rationalism espoused and imposed by the Caliph al-Ma'mun, which put him in shackles and brought him to be tried by the Caliph, who was leading the jihad on the Syrian frontier. Al-Ma'mun's sudden death allowed Ibn Ḥanbal to return to Baghdad, where he was eventually flogged to the point of death for upholding a view that the Quran was uncreated, a view which seemed too close, at least for some, to the Christian belief in Jesus's uncreatedness as the word of God. Ibn Ḥanbal's alleged refusal to declare the Quran created made him famous as a defender of what was then proto-Sunni dogma. But his major importance is as a teacher of ḥadīth and a responder to questions about tricky parts of law that were later compiled in responsa texts, a foundational genre, if we can call it that, of legal literature for the Ḥanbalī school of law. One of the great compilers of these responsa texts was Abū Bakr al-Khallāl. Himself had never met Ibn Ḥanbal, but he compiled a massive work, which is abbreviated as the Compendium. And he compiled just a small portion of it, or an excerpt from it, called Ahl al-Milal, which we'll talk about in just a few moments. It's all about non-Muslim communities. It's during al-Khallāl's life that we see textual evidence of a burgeoning community developing around Ibn Ḥanbal's teachings, and a community that grew up into a popular movement by the time of the late 9th and early 10th centuries. Al-Khallāl plays a crucial role in formal madhab or legal school, a development that Christopher Melchert has associated with the creation or the writing of a biographical dictionary. Al-Khallāl's life, works, and compilation of non-Muslim religious communities, the book that we'll be talking about, as an excerpt of this larger work, the compendium, with all of its content, also played a crucial role in offering a comprehensive view of the Christian and Jew and other non-Muslims as legal subjects. So the text today that I'm going to be talking about in detail and talking to you more about the interpretive Christian and what that means is called non-Muslim religious communities, the abbreviated translation. Because Ibn Ḥanbal himself never systematized his responses to many questions he was asked during a long and active life, Al-Khallāl's compilation, organization, and discussion of this material is of critical importance. Non-Muslim religious communities lends coherence to Ibn Ḥanbal's views of Christians and other non-Muslims answers in a way that reveals Al-Khallāl's ideological and theological intervention into his sources. In doing so, it articulates what Ibn Ḥanbal evidently intended to be a definitive view of non-Muslim individuals and their communities for the emerging Ḥanbalī school. And it does so in a way that Ibn Ḥanbal never did. What we have in this text are very short masāʻil or responsa, and Ibn Ḥanbal's often one-line responses that were woven together by the organizing editorial mind of Al-Khallāl. What we find in non-Muslim religious communities is rather predictable when compared to other 9th and 10th century legal books, at least in content. One might get the impression from reading through it that not much new took place between non-Muslims and Muslims as they moved into closer living quarters, which we know is not really the case. So you can see here on the screen just the topical headings of the chapters. It looks very much like many other books for those of us who immerse ourselves in books of law.
Chris?
Yes.
I think you're trying to share something with us and we can't see it.
Oh, you guys can't see the presentation. All right, so I'll walk you back through the slides really quickly.
We actually still can't see it. Are you trying to share?
Yeah, it's not letting me share here. Let me just see. İlāќ, you have the setting on?
You are the co-host, so I think you can, but I'll make you a full host. So
no, we're good. I think I got it here.
Yeah.
I just forgot to click the button. That's my fault. Okay. So just walking you through the slides, you don't really need to see much. I've given the presentation here about Ibn Ḥanbal and Baghdad and Al-Khallāl. And here's a little manuscript from the text and what the chapter titles look like. Looks a lot like other Islamic legal books. Okay, so again here, what we find is rather predictable. And that brings me to my point about the essentialized hermeneutical non-Muslim. So the concept of the hermeneutical non-Muslim is adapted from Jeremy Cohen's monumental study on the Christian idea of the Jew in late antique and medieval periods. In his book that you can see here, Living Letters of the Law, Cohen coherently and really convincingly argues that the church fathers such as Augustine and Aquinas saw Jews only as a means to understand Christian eschatological and soteriological views, that is, as an interpretive device in discussions of Christian theology. The figure of the Jew, from this perspective, served to confirm the Christian view that Christians are the heirs of salvation through Jesus Christ. And in teasing out the theological meaning of the hermeneutical Jews, Cohen shows that the representation of Jews in Christian literature are as they were supposed to be, not who they actually were, indicating that Christians wrote about Jews based on literary images of them. So my main contribution to the field of Islamic studies is to exemplify a new approach to Islamic legal literature, one that may help us understand what discussions about Christians and Jews and other non-Muslims tell us about Muslims. In other words, just as Cohen reads the hermeneutical Jew as a device for Christians to understand their own salvation, I likewise show how the Christians and Jews we meet in the pages of non-Muslim religious communities, the text of our focus, tells us about the legal, social, economic, and theological notions of Muslim piety, identity, salvation, and legal authority. I can do this because most of the responsa, or the masāʻil, in non-Muslim religious communities are rooted in discussions taking place at least a century before, some of which have little bearing on social circumstances, others that do, except perhaps as pedagogical principles for issuing legal determinations. The hermeneutical Christian and Jew that emerges from the text corresponds to no particular Christian or Jew of history. Rather, he or she is an asynchronous conglomeration or non-chronological compilation of events, experiences, and characteristics spanning centuries of Christian and Jewish interaction with Muslims, with an emphasis on earlier interactions. So the non-Muslims of this text, non-Muslim religious communities, are the ones who never were and the ones who never will be. In Arabic, they have one name or a few names: al-Nasrani, Christian, al-Yahudi, Jew, and sometimes categorized as the Kitabis, those with the book, or Dhimmis in different contexts. These figures behave in a particular way and ultimately serve as kind of representatives of non-Muslims of all times and periods, insofar as they're subjects of law. I mean, of course, Muslims would have distinguished between real life and legal thought. So let's take a look at how this idea of the hermeneutical or interpretive non-Muslim works. Okay, so in this section, you're going to learn how Ibn Ḥanbal interprets commercial contracts with non-Muslims to show them to be untrustworthy, impious, and worldly, whereas Muslims are quite the opposite. They're trustworthy, they're pious, and devout. So to understand this, we have to see a few things. One is that in the wake of conquests after preceding the death of the Prophet Muhammad, non-Muslims and Muslims began to work with one another more and more in commerce. They already had, but since Muslims observe distinct regulations that, at least in principle, govern their commercial transactions in ways distinct from non-Muslims, there's a long tradition of legal discussion and debate that emerged about how Muslims were to transact with non-Muslims. We know very little about the prophetic precedents, the ḥadīth and the sunnah, regarding the contracts formed and the businesses transacted between Muslims and non-Muslims. But one thing is for sure, in the Quran, God condemned illicit uses of money. And this is actually what Ibn Ḥanbal, this is a verse here from the Quran that Ibn Ḥanbal cites in discussions of contracts. And I'll tie this in the next slide on exactly how this works. So the essentialized persona, the kind of the way that non-Muslims are seen, or at least Jews and Christians in this case, are dishonest, and it's rooted for Ibn Ḥanbal in this verse. Among the people of the book, Jews and Christians, are some who, if entrusted with a qintar, that is a large portion, will pay it back to you. There are others who, if entrusted with a dinar, a smaller portion, will not pay it back to you unless you continually stand over them. That is because they believe, quote, there is nothing to stop us when it comes to al-ummiyin. So here you have, the Quran presupposes that some Christians and Jews can deal honestly with material wealth. But in Ibn Ḥanbal's view, the Quran only really does so insofar as it sets a bar of honesty that everyone ought to follow. So generally speaking, the point of Ibn Ḥanbal's citation of Quran 375 is that Christians and Jews are those who do not deal honestly with non-Christians or non-Jews. And that's the last part of the verse, at least when it comes to material wealth. And they're holding back. And when Jews and Christians hold back their share of payment on the loan or dupe a Muslim on a contract, results in God holding back their share in the hereafter, as the following verses 76 and 77 contend. I haven't put them up here. For Ibn Ḥanbal, the Quran makes this a general claim of truth, one that permeates other discussions of contracts with non-Muslims. So I haven't put up a lot of these generic types of questions that are asked, but they read something like this. Can Muslims form such and such partnership or engage in such and such contract with a Jew or a Christian? And the answer is inevitably that they can, as long as the Muslim is in charge of the buying and selling of goods. The reason being, as a textbook example, that Christians drink wine or Jews drink wine, Christians raise pigs, something along that. This is kind of like a textbook reason why they shouldn't engage with, they shouldn't let Christians or Jews engage with Muslims, or at least control the purchasing and buying, because they can engage in these illicit goods or commodities. So if a Muslim transacts with a Christian or Jew and gives him authority over a commercial enterprise, the Muslim is implicated too because of the suspicious behaviors they exhibit and their illicit use of money or wine or any of the other stereotypically illicit applies to many parts of a transaction, such as the purchasing and selling, which I've mentioned, but also the appraising, transporting, packing, storing, and unloading goods. Further, there are issues about what types and how much money can be received in coin or in credit, or what standard weights and measures will be used. All of these factors, which aren't visible in the generic reports, are really implied and internal to partnership contracts at any stage of the partnership, because they might result in the breaking of the requirements of fair legal exchange if undertaken with non-Muslims. So Christians and Jews cannot be an authority over Muslims in commerce, because the former are likely not to observe the law, at least from the Muslim view, that applies to such contracts. Or in short, Christians are characterized, Jews are characterized as engaging in illicit activities not native to proper Muslim practice, and thus serve to show their inability to participate in fair exchange with Muslims. The static representation of Christians and Jews that we saw in the Quranic verse is also applied to contracts, helps demonstrate the superiority of the Islamic legal system, idealizing it and the Muslims who ought to engage with it through licit practices or halal practices. The main point in all of this is to say that for Ibn Ḥanbal, conversation about commerce and contracts serves as a site of discussion of Christian and Jewish dishonesty. Ibn Ḥanbal's view of Christians and Jews in this light is a way for him to define who Muslims are in contrast to non-Muslims, or at least to show how Muslims ought to be in relationship to them. It is a way to define the pious Muslim as legally upright compared to essentialized non-Muslims or Christians and Jews as legally incompetent. In other words, debates about economic exchange and contract are, for Ibn Ḥanbal and his students, a Muslim assertion of identity or self-conception. Muslims who by virtue relate the Prophet and the companions and are thus ideally more legally upright and trustworthy in business. I don't have time to go into all the different types of contracts or to tease out all of the nuances of the text here at the bottom. But one of the main issues for Ibn Ḥanbal is that Christians and Jews can't be trusted to know contract law and to uphold God's law. And therefore, they bring uncertainty into contracts, which Ibn Ḥanbal kind of equates with this term riba, or a loose translation is usury, but it doesn't quite work. But that would take some more time up than we have. So the issue here is that Christians and Jews bring uncertainty into contracts as well. That non-Muslims are corrupt or bring uncertainty into contracts also applies to non-Muslim women who come into the household. And in this portion, you're going to learn how Ibn Ḥanbal's rulings on non-Muslim women in the Muslim household reveal a vision of a better world where only Muslims exist, or at least more Muslims exist. Just as with the uncertainty in contracts, women bring in corruption and uncertainty, or non-Muslim women, excuse me, bring in corruption and uncertainty into the Muslim household when there's intermarriage. This is why Ibn Ḥanbal avoids taking Christian or Jewish wives, slaves, concubines into his household. The Christian and Jewish woman, we will see, is one who invites contamination and legal uncertainty into the household, not to mention slanderous words against the Prophet Muhammad. And this really shows how Ibn Ḥanbal's discussion of non-Muslim women tried to keep her or them at a distance. Some of the earliest reports purporting to tell us about blasphemy come from stories about a Jewish woman blaspheming the Prophet and consequently being killed. In one version of the story recounted by Ibn Ḥanbal, a blind Muslim man has a Jewish woman in his house. We are told that she is kind to him and she feeds him. But then the story pivots to discuss a major problem. She consistently blasphemes or defames the Prophet in his presence. Day after day, he patiently puts up with her blasphemy until he gets angry and strangles her to death. The next day, the Prophet calls the Muslims together, or the believers together, though we are not told where or when the story takes place, and asks who is responsible, in a manner suggesting that he approves. The man stands up and gives his reasons. recounting her blasphemy, and the prophet, preemptively answering the man's concern, responds that no blood price or recompense is required for her. In another version of the story, we are told that the Jewish woman is an Walid, or an enslaved woman who has the child of a Muslim master. And this is another version of the same story. And she too consistently and frequently blasphemes the prophet in the presence of the blind Muslim man. Day after day, he puts up with it, warning her over and over until he becomes fed up. One night, we are told, she really digs in and disparages and defames the prophet, leading him to pull out his small dagger and place it on her belly. He leans on it, killing her. Incidentally, it seems that there is one of the children resting between her legs on the bed when she is killed and is spattered with blood from the stabbing. The Jewish woman conceived of as a caretaker, or in the other version of the story, an Walid, again, an enslaved woman who has the child of a Muslim master. These images serve as one archetype of non-Muslim behavior in the Muslim household, used to express caution against bringing them into it. The stories of blasphemy are an axis of discussion of the role of non-Muslim women in the Muslim household. They are a first step in showing how non-Muslim women are liabilities that invite more harm than help into the Muslim household. In turn, discussions about hudud, or punishments for blasphemy, at least as they're categorized in our source text today, non-Muslim religious communities, reflects a broader notion of hermeneutical Christian and Jewish women and the complications that arise when Muslims and non-Muslims come to coexist and live in close proximity to one another. So we see this same idea of non-Muslim women who marry Muslim men or come into a Muslim household posing a threat, and that is from their free practice of religion. So Ibn Hanbal's default position about Muslims and non-Muslims living in the same household is that they can freely practice their religion without interference, but that doing so also brings up issues about Muslim ritual purity and male authority over women. So, for example, if a Jewish or Christian woman is observing a fast or some other ritual observance, they might be able to refrain from having sex with a husband, which in turn challenges the male authority in the household. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. But we see the same thing for women threatening the integrity of the Muslim household when they, or at least Christians in this case, bring idols into the house, something the essentialized Christian always does. Muslims should command non-Muslim women, or Christian women in this case, to avoid bringing idols into the house, because the cross for Ibn Ḥanbal is a vulgarity of religious innovation and is an idol. Yet at the same time, he argues that a Muslim can't prohibit her from bringing it into the house. His idea of the non-Muslim woman is that she is ever a threat to the integrity of the oneness of God. She brings in idols and shirk, or unbelief, into the household, which Muslims, legally speaking, cannot get around. The same goes for a Muslim slave, or a slave or wife who might drink wine. The same free practice of religion is present here. The Muslim man can command her not to, but he can't compel her not to. The problem for Muslims is that if this literary Christian or Jew drinks wine, so too does the child, corrupting a Muslim's child in her belly, or potential child in her belly. It's by virtue of Christianity or Judaism means that she's going to drink wine in the household. In so doing, she contaminates it and causes a Muslim to sin, not the husband or the enslaver, but the father's lineage, by compromising the natural disposition of the child as a Muslim. In other words, causing Muslim belly to sin. Her behaviors actually make the child more Christian or Jewish, which we'll see here in the next slide when we talk about breastfeeding and transferring shirk or unbelief. So domestic practices also pose a threat to Muslim integrity and piety when non-Muslims come into the Muslim household. Ibn Hanbal's rulings on midwifery show that the legal threat of allowing Christians and Jews into the household is that they fail to uphold the religious requirements of it. They might look upon the hair and bodies of a Muslim woman, which for Ibn Ḥanbal is unacceptable, or they might see the bodies of women during the birthing process if they're serving as midwives, also unacceptable for Ibn Ḥanbal. And non-Muslim midwives pose another threat to the integrity of the Muslim household. They can't witness in court. What do I mean? If they can't legally testify in court, they can't testify about the complications arising from the birthing process. A midwife's testimony in court might be essential to establishing whether a child is born alive or dead. Her testimony is interwoven into several aspects of money and property. A stillborn child might incur financial penalties on the appropriate party if it was the result of an intentional abortion. If that child is born moving and then dies, a larger financial penalty is due. Another consequence of allowing a non-Muslim midwife to serve in the Muslim household is that she might invalidate an inheritance dispute resulting from a childbirth. For Ibn Ḥanbal, a child must cry after being born for it to have the rights of inheritance from a father or family members. If the child only moves but doesn't cry and then dies, the child is not a valid heir. A child born crying immediately upon birth becomes an heir and property owner, affecting household wealth. The stakes are also high for an enslaved Christian or Jewish woman bearing a child to her enslaver, that is, becoming an walid. She only becomes free upon the conception of a child, but not a stillborn child. In other words, she only gets the chance of freedom, which is what happens when you're an walid and you bear a child to a Muslim master. She only gets to become free or get manumitted if the viability of the fetus can be proven. A midwife's testimony in a case requires the midwife's expertise and integrity, two things Ibn Ḥanbal can't conceptualize a non-Muslim to possess, if only because she cannot be expected or trusted to know Islamic law or the law in general, or even fear the consequences of breaking it. Wet nursing too. It's not just financial liability that non-Muslim women pose, but the potential to transmit shirk or unbelief. Christian and Jewish women transmit their unbelief or shirk through their bodies. Their breast milk transmits their essence to Muslim children, according to Ibn Ḥanbal. It's not just the things that they might bring in, like a cross or wine, but it's their very being that is a vessel of sin. This is why Muslims are encouraged to breastfeed non-Muslim women's children, based on the famous ḥadīth that says one becomes like the woman who suckles it. It's for this reason that a Christian or Jewish walid who does not have the right to, who actually doesn't have a right to breastfeed their child that they bear to a Muslim enslaver. The Christian and Jewish woman of the household contaminates Muslim children and makes them more like Christians or Jews. Non-Muslim women pass down shirk, the worst of all sins for Ibn Ḥanbal. So Ibn Ḥanbal's legal argument emphasizes a very narrow view of non-Muslim women as threats to piety because of their religious innovations or blasphemous tongues. They pose a threat to male authority because the law gives protection for them to practice their religion, and a threat to lineage because non-Muslim women corrupt children through their wine drinking, breast milk, and invalid testimony. All of these put at risk salvation for Muslims. Their free practice of religion, despite having sanction in the Quran and Sunnah, are stumbling blocks to Muslims who want to live integrous, pious lives without religious lies or innovation. The essentialized shape and figure of non-Muslims, given in reports of the blaspheming woman and the domestic practices, serve as a warning to Muslims to be above reproach to do everything to avoid sin and breaking the law. Implicit to Ibn Ḥanbal's views is that the world is best imagined to be completely Muslim. Muslims ought to make more Muslims without fear of them becoming more Jewish or Christian because of their religious practices or because of their bodies. The story about the Jewish woman blaspheming the Prophet is just one example of what happens when taking non-Muslim women into the household, and it's a cautionary tale for integrous Muslims to follow. Ḥanbal's hesitancy, at least on his own behalf, to marry or bring in non-Muslim women into the household does not mean that he views all Christians and Jews as lost. Unborn, stillborn, and young children might have a chance at going to paradise despite the religious perversions of their parents, since they cannot be responsible for sin, as we're going to see in this next section. So in this portion of the lecture, you're going to learn how non-Muslims are used in legal discussions to help Muslims work out the mechanics or the process of salvation. You see hell here represented on the left and heaven on the right, and some background here. So in the 9th century, legal scholars and theologians often discuss what happens to non-Muslim children who die before reaching adulthood, a big question. Many first-generation Muslims, before they had converted, also lost children. Given this, there's questions about where their children end up, in paradise, in heaven, or in hell, eventually come to be a concern. For example, did the Prophet's first wife, Khadijah's children, go to paradise or hell? After all, she had converted to Islam after her children died. Does that make her children infidels? The same question be posed about Muhammad's son Ibrahim, born to a Christian woman who died in infancy, and also to children killed in early Muslim raids in Arabia or the initial Islamic conquests. In what circumstances and under what conditions does a child go to paradise or hell? Prior to and during the life of Ibn Ḥanbal, these questions and the resulting answers began to be applied to non-Muslims, which inadvertently answer questions about the children of Muslims who died before Islam or after its advent. For Ibn Ḥanbal, a Muslim who fulfills the divine law by adhering to the Sunnah has a chance to go to paradise, but it's never guaranteed. But can Christian or Jewish children go to paradise or hell? Are they responsible to fulfill the law or stand in judgment before God for sins? Or what happens if a Christian or Jewish convert to Islam? What happens if they convert? One of the main topics of discussion has to do with whether a fetus or child is innocent before God and thus not responsible for sin. Another related topic, we'll talk about that in a moment. Another related topic has to do with whether a child inherits his parents' religious disposition or his fitrah and is judged accordingly in the hereafter. Some scholars and theologians tend to view all children as innocent and therefore bound to paradise, regardless of their sin or religious disposition. Others tend to view them as condemned necessarily to hell, and still others take an intermediate position. Ibn Ḥanbal views questions about the fate of Christians and Jews as problematic because of all of the theoretical questions that they raise. For him, questions about the fate of mankind are answered plainly enough in ḥadīths without a need to harmonize them or logically connect them to one another. The problem for students of law is the extent to which the hadith and the verses of the Quran, and if those same verses that apply to Muslims can be applied to non-Muslims. A big question looming in the background for Ibn Ḥanbal's students is what a child needs to do, if anything, to be considered a Muslim and be rewarded salvation. Questions about Christian and Jewish children serve as hermeneutical tools for working out the mechanics of salvation for all mankind. And we'll talk about that more here in a second. Ibn Ḥanbal responds to questions like the one on your screen about God's knowledge of all human action by citing Quran 50:18, which describes God as recording the deeds and thoughts of all humans. Sorry, the verse isn't on your screen, but the question is on your screen that his students had. And he cites Quran 50:18, which says, "No word does he utter without a watcher beside him," meaning that God knows the deeds, he knows the actions, the thoughts of all people. And that asking such questions, students asking such questions to him is makruh. It's a despicable type of question. The reason al-Khallāl in his compilation of Ibn Ḥanbal's works includes this question is really, it kind of reads like a story. It sets the stage for the preceding reports to see if children have to bear the sins of their forefathers or of their parents. The question about the deeds of unbelievers is set within the context of children and leads to questions about whether unbelievers are with their parents in death. In other words, are they anchored to their parents' religious disposition? The question is asking if the child automatically goes to hell because of their parents, which is also a question about the responsibility of children for the sins of their ancestors, or at least of their parents. Without getting into all of the details, Ibn Ḥanbal ends up taking the position you see here in green, that God knows best what they would have done had they lived. This is a really important phrase for the Ḥanbalīs because it's significant for understanding the early Ḥanbalī position about Christian and Jewish children potentially going to paradise, because it ultimately explains how the Ḥanbalīs view sin, responsibility, and the predestination of these children in the hereafter. That is how salvation works, or the mechanics of salvation. It helps answer how the process of salvation, whether or not these children are responsible for the sins of their parents, as I've said. How could a Christian or Jewish child, for example, be responsible for sin if he is an embryo, a fetus, unborn, aborted, or stillborn? What happens to a child who dies in the womb as a result of his mother's untimely death? After all, at this point in the child's life, the child lived and has not been born, let alone sinned, but God knows them, as we saw in Ibn Hanbal's citation of the
Chris, we can't hear you.
Chris, are you there? We can't hear you. Or now we can see you, but we can't hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now, yes, we can.
Okay, can you tell me where I left off? Because I don't know when I got cut off. Let me pull up the slide. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you hear this slide here?
Yes, we just lost you about 10 or 20 seconds ago. So
Okay. Okay. So for Ibn Hanbal, a child, whether Christian, Jewish, or Muslim, is fully formed in the womb after 120 days, where God writes upon them their good and evil deeds. And in this view, regardless of whether a child is born or has completed actions that might be considered sinful is really insignificant. God has already determined, according to Ibn Hanbal, what they would do in the future, and thus their place in the hereafter is predetermined only by God. This is clearly shown in discourse on stillborn children, a topic which helps us understand the mechanics of salvation for Muslims and consequently the potential path of paradise extended to non-Muslims. So in other words, all these conversations
You're stuck again, Chris.
Chris, we lost you. Can you hear us?
The spirit of Ibn Hanbal is haunting us.
Chris, are you there? I'll try writing to him.
All right, I'm back.
Yeah, we lost you about half a minute ago. So
Okay.
take it back.
The nature of when you do this at home, you never know what's going to happen with the internet. It's a little less stable. Okay. So let's pick up here. So the issue with the question about stillborn children is that according to the 120-day developmental period of a child, the fetus is only considered a viable person after God has breathed into it. If God never breathes life into a child, can it resurrect? In other words, it hasn't formed into a person. There's a lot of text on this in our source text of Ahl al-Milal, or the non-Muslim religious communities. And it's unclear to me exactly if a stillborn child who has not received God's inbreathing will arrive at the gates of paradise or prostrate himself before God. But it is clear, what is clear is that Ibn Hanbal seems to view that God determines what they would have done had they lived, and that one day they will stand before God in judgment. This also applies to embryos and presumably fetuses who die in the womb beyond 120 days as a result of their mother's untimely death. Surprisingly, the hadith about the resurrection of unborn or stillborn children that I didn't put here is cited is not really about non-Muslims at all. It's really about Muslims. The application of this hadith, again, not on the screen, about stillborn Muslim children in applying this to Christian and Jewish children is really the work of al-Khallāl. By applying the hadith to them, al-Khallāl places them into a larger legal rationale of Ibn Ḥanbal, a point we should not overlook. It indicates that Christian and Jewish children will stand in God's judgment just as all mankind will and might have a path to paradise. This is not to say, of course, that Ibn Ḥanbal supports a position that innocent non-Muslim children necessarily go to paradise or hell, but it means that he leaves the possibility open-ended, or perhaps even, as the later Ḥanbalī jurist Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah put it, the ruling is suspended, meaning something along the lines of uncertain. And this is the key point. Viewing Christian children as potentially able to go to paradise means that Muslims cannot say what God chooses to do with Christian and Jewish children. We can speculate that God writes conversion into some Christian or Jewish children's souls, meaning that Christian and Jewish children, like Muslim children, are not guaranteed paradise or hell. Some, for example, are born believers and end up in hell, and others are born unbelievers and end up in heaven. All of this means that Muslims must, by all means possible, though not explicitly stated, take responsibility to care for Christian children. They are not inevitably forsaken by God to enter hell, a point taken up in the next portion. So in this portion, you're going to learn how non-Muslim children are used as interpretive devices to help Muslims work out the mechanics of conversion. Again, this is all implicit to the text. This is my reading of the text, as there's something more than just what it says in the law. The mechanics of conversion argument that I have here is all done through the discussion of war or jihad. The Ḥanbalī mechanics of salvation that I just discussed, or the mechanics, how the reports reflect the mechanics of salvation, leave some questions unresolved. There is tension about the natural disposition of a child. Is every child born a Muslim and only becomes a Christian or a Jew because of his parents? Let's take a look at an entry on jihad in non-Muslim religious communities. So Ibn Ḥanbal has asked the question here in black. What if a child still breastfeeding is taken as a captive from Byzantium without anyone to breastfeed it? Ibn Ḥanbal responds, well, it should be given food and water, and if it dies, it dies. In another response, he says, well, if the child dies, at least it dies with Muslims. If it lives likewise with Muslims. So it's a win-win situation when non-Muslim children are captured. Although the content of the question, this question and ones like it, seem to be about practical applications for a conscript military, non-professional military, we learn that more is at stake. Questions about children raise crucial theological questions about the justification for war in the first place. What ontologically happens to children, or what metaphysically happens to children when they are captured? We learned before that all children have a potential path to paradise, but how does this actually work in the metaphorical realm, or in the metaphysical realm, rather? The answer is that jihad and capturing children results in Christian and Jewish children converting to Islam necessarily and immediately. Taking Christian and Jewish children as captives provides a solution not for salvation necessarily, but for compelling them to be Muslims. That is, one step closer to God's will for them to be Muslims. Ibn Ḥanbal's ruling on Christian and Jewish captives helps him accomplish a larger goal of making the unbelievers more Muslim. Muslims are required to care for Christian and Jewish captives, and this is justified because it involves rescuing Christian and Jewish children from the shirk or unbelief of their parents. God delegates to Muslims the legal authority to convert the world of foreigners, the upshot of which is a world with less shirk or unbelief. The hermeneutical Christian and Jew serves as an axis of theological discussion about the mechanics of conversion and natural human disposition, revealing also a justification for war. In short, we learn more about how war serves as a catalyst to make the world more Muslim, all the while inadvertently spelling out mechanics of conversion for all mankind. This will be our last slide before concluding. So Ibn Ḥanbal himself doesn't advocate for the forced conversion of adults, which many early Muslim scholars did, but he thinks, as we have seen, that children taken without parents, if they're taken captive and their parents aren't there, that they do automatically and immediately become Muslims once in Muslim hands. This is spelled out even more clearly when we read other entries that inadvertently reveal the mechanics of conversion. So for this first one, Ibn Ḥanbal has asked something along the lines of, what if the child's parents die? Well, he cites the ḥadīth, their parents make them Jewish or Christian. And then in another entry, he says, every child is born into the religious disposition of his parents. What this basically means is the parents, we can see here that the moment the child's parents die, he is no longer anchored into their faith. He doesn't have parents to make them Jewish or Christian anymore. Therefore, they're not Jewish or Christian. They immediately become Muslims. This is, in other words, a discussion of Christian and Jewish children that explains the process of the ontological or metaphysical change of status, or to put it simply, how conversion from one religion to another takes place, and all through discussions on jihad and war. The second question here on your screen, what about, or what if one parent converts, or if one of the parents convert? And here, pretty straightforwardly, Ibn Ḥanbal says, the children belong to the Muslim parent. If the children were mature adults, don't compel them to Islam, because the Prophet said, again here, the parents make them Jewish or Christian, meaning once that when they're children, they're anchored to their parents. Once they're an adult, they're not. The child belongs to the parent once one parent converts, and the other parent might have. The mechanics of conversion are such that when any parent converts, the child becomes tethered to that parent, now a Muslim, thereby rendering them also a Muslim. The nation of the child immediately passes from the converted parent to the child. What is important is that whether or not this was lived out or not, the process of conversion is fairly clear. It happens immediately for children without parents, and the only thing holding the world back from less shirk are their parents. If the parent converts, the problem is solved, and the children immediately and ontologically revert back to their original state of being. That is the primordial state of being of Islam, being born into their original disposition. They return to their primordial state, the state God created them to be in. Okay, so we're just about winding down here. Let me just do a very brief recap, and then happy to answer any questions if there are any. So what have we learned? What I've tried to show here is that non-Muslims serve as interpretive devices reflecting Muslim self-conceptions as superior to non-Muslims, as I argued in the portion on there's more at stake in legal arguments than just the legal content itself. There's something ideologically reflected in them. Also, non-Muslims threaten the integrity of the Muslim household, and the world is better imagined without them. We saw this in the section on women, and concepts of salvation and conversion result from the discussions about non-Muslims. We saw this in the children, and also in the children, this portion on the children, that the world should look more Muslim, the original disposition. Thank you so much for your time. Sorry for the technical errors. Hope that I can answer any questions that you have.
Hey, thank you, Chris, for this fascinating lecture. We now open the floor for questions from the audience. Feel free to ask. If no one has a question, I have a question already. So I think I'll start with your permission. I have several questions, but I think I'll start with the general one. Your approach has been to see how discussion of Christians and other non-Muslims reflect an idea about Muslims. How is this approach different from what others have done in the field, and why do you think it is profitable, quote unquote?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for the question. So how does my research fit into the broader questions in the field? Well, I think that we just have to step back and look at some of the bigger questions. How do we understand Muslims from the textual sources that we have? And this has been done in different ways. So for example, some in the West have said, okay, well, we can't really trust the sources, so we're going to look to non-Muslim sources to understand Muslim identity or Muslim ideas of themselves. And this is famously done by Patricia Crona and Michael Cook, I think, in Hagerism, a very famous book that drew a lot of attention. So that was criticized that approach and said, look, we've got to look at all of the textual sources and the material evidence that's out there to understand who Muslims are, how they conceive of themselves. And there's been other approaches since on how to really get at what we can learn about Muslims from texts or from material evidence. And my approach was really just to take the reports without criticizing necessarily their authenticity, and let them speak for themselves as the Ḥanbalī school spoke. So other people have done this in the field as well. One great example is David Friedenreich's Foreigners and Their Food, where he does something very similar to what I do, but in different terms. And he looks at the Quran and the food laws and how these things reflect differentiation and similarity between Muslims, Jews, and Christians. So I hope that what I'm doing is just another version of understanding how, and actually Professor Simonson helped me rephrase it this way, is, trying to understand Muslims from the way that they saw others, instead of how to understand Muslims or Islam from looking at texts outside of what they wrote. It's just a different approach. And I hope that it's just another way to see how to read the texts in ways that we can understand this really rich and diverse community of people.
Great, thank you, Chris. I actually have a few more questions, but I see that Yoni has another question, so go ahead, Yoni.
First of all, thank you. It was fascinating. So I'm not a scholar of Baghdad or Islamic thought of that period, but I'm interested. I taught a bit about Tabari and the Ḥanbalites and how they persecuted him and how he died, alone in his house in Baghdad because of the students of Ibn Ḥanbal. I was wondering if other scholars at the time of Ibn Ḥanbal's time were discussing Jews and Christians in a different way. And also, how does this project on this imagery that we have on cosmopolitan, very inclusive Baghdad of the early centuries? Because what you show here, even if this is only a way to understand how Islam speaks about itself and uses Jews and Muslims to talk about what a proper Muslim should behave. It's excluding Jews and Christians. So first, how do other scholars write about this at the time? And second, what does this say about the social history of Baghdad during its golden age?
Okay, so it's a great question. The first thing is that al-Khallāl was very much against these kind of very aggressive Ḥanbalīs. Early Ḥanbalism, under the teachings of al-Khallāl, who compiled all Ibn Ḥanbal's teachings, were really religiously quiet. They're quietist. Ḥanbalism wasn't united under one banner at the time. So you definitely have a degree of difference between these early Ḥanbalīs and the ones who, may have later, went and tore down houses or broke instruments and did things. Al-Khallāl is very much in the kind of tradition of quietism. And for this text itself, I think one way to address your question about what the students taught, what other students taught of Ibn Ḥanbal, it's in this book. It is the definitive collection of what his students who learned with him, and it's all in the Isnad. Everything it's supposed to be a definitive collection, I think. That's my argument. Everything that was said about Ibn Ḥanbal, that Ibn Ḥanbal said about non-Muslims is really supposed to be in this text. But he did obviously miss a lot, and you can kind of recover these from other responsa texts. But really, this is the collection where we find out what Ibn Ḥanbal students were teaching. As for like the social history question, You know, I struggled to try to contextualize a lot of these reports. I ended up becoming an intellectual kind of historian rather than a social one because it requires a lot of work. I'm trying to now, actually. I'm back to grinding it out to see how it works out. But I think a lot of how we have to see the Ḥanbalīs is really as literalists. They're reading reports as literalists against a stream of thought that is not, and that is kind of more accommodating to the world and intellectual ideas. I think that's all I can say about it for now. I wish I had more to share with you, and happy to talk any other time, but I think that this book very much reflects an ideological view. There is some social information in there, of course, that reflects some of the Ḥanbalī views, but not much. Thanks for the question, Yoni.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have another question from the audience? Yes, Ido, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Fascinating lecture. Sort of a follow-up question to Yoni's question. I think you have a very well-articulated research question, a very original perspective to view Ibn Ḥanbal's text and response and so on. But what was missing indeed from your presentation was a broader conceptualization, a broader contextualization. We didn't hear anything about, you know, the broader perspective on Ibn Ḥanbal's views, theological and jurisdictional and so on. So we don't know how it relates to his stance in this regard. We also didn't hear anything about how it relates to other schools of law, to other generations within the Ḥanbalī schools. So you mentioned al-Khallāl and how he was, in a way, a quietist, and that's very nice. But still, I mean, beyond the importance of understanding Ibn Ḥanbal's views as a persona, as an historical figure, how does this? What does it tell us about intellectual trends and this idea of interpretive non-Muslims? It's fascinating, but it needs to be contextualized. Otherwise, it's like it's floating in you know, it is detached from other discourses. So I'll be grateful to hear.
Yeah. Look, I know. You know, in a way, I became like I was reading it very much as like a legal student might read it, but I'm not recovering all of their information. That was intentional because I wanted to see how the literalists read it. But yeah, it's of course, it's missing, you know, there's only so much I could bite off in my dissertation. And my next step is really to contextualize and to apply this same method profitably to other schools, which requires a whole different tool set. So you point out all things that are very good observations, ones that I'm internalizing and trying to work out on how this works in other legal discourses and how to fit this into the events or the larger perspectives. But, you know, at the same time, for the Ḥanbalīs, they're literalists. They don't seem to care about a lot. I mean, they just read the report and say, this is what it's, that black letter of the law. It doesn't matter what's going on in the world. And that was kind of one of my points. But I think it needs to be a little bit, I know it needs to be much broader. So I really appreciate your comments. I agree with you. And I hope that you'll read my book when I contextualize it so you can say, look, I helped.
With pleasure.
Okay, Serena, I see that you raised your hand. Do you have a question here?
Hello, thank you so much. I'm sorry, it's all a bit complicated for me because I'm like fixing my door also. The person just came today, and so I have to press the thing here. But thank you so much for your interesting talk. I had a similar question as Ido. But I'm thinking about it also in terms of the Christian context. I don't know if you've looked at it, and it seems to me that in the Christian context, the 10th century was very much, or was not yet as dichotomous as it came across from your, well, that's actually my question. Is it as dichotomous as you presented it? Or is it actually, are these identities more fluid? Are they more permeable? Because from your talk, it sounds really dichotomous. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Leah Deboon's new book, The Shape of Sex. That's she examined sex in the Christian sources. And she argues that this very dichotomous notion is a product of the 13th century in the Christian context. So I'm just asking you, but again, that's asking for the broader context that Ido has brought up. And I don't think it's not okay to just read one source, right? That's fine and important for us to do, but then, yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the question about, you know, how do Muslims think about, in law, how do they think about non-Muslims? I mean, they're bound to these literary characterizations almost, or these Quranic versions of them. And that's the point of the hermeneutical. Oh, did we lose her? Well, I'm going to answer her question anyways, and I don't think she's here anymore. Oh, you are there. Oh, you just moved.
I am here.
So the way that Christians and Jews and others are constructed is different in every school, though they might be drawing from similar pools of hadith and Quranic verses. They all kind of think about and engage with Christians and Jews in different ways. There may be overlapping principles and ideas, but I think ultimately, this is my point, is that they're constructed differently using different verses, different ideas about them, kind of as a mechanical literary figure. So, I mean, but I don't think in social history that bears out at all. I mean, the Christian historiography tells quite a different story and interprets things quite differently. But again, yeah, this was my approach in trying to understand how one text that's supposed to be definitive paints a broad picture of what this subject of the non-Muslim looks like. Yeah, and I hope you also read my book. I'll write your name down and I'll send you one as soon as it's done, but it's going to take some time.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, we don't hear you, Elad.
Sorry, Ido, do you have a question? I saw you raise your hand.
I just remember there's this wonderful book by Ian McEwan. I'm sorry, I don't remember the title, about a fetus. A fetus, he's the narrator, the fetus. And he's not only the narrator, he's also a moral figure. And he acts upon his parents. So in a way, Ian McEwan takes a Ḥanbalī view about the fetus. So you may refer to it in your book.
Thank you, sir.
I actually have another question, Chris, with your permission. What I wanted to ask is, to what extent are the masāʻil hypothetical or reflective of social reality, or actually, how can you tell the difference at all?
These are all great questions. So I think the easiest way to understand this is if you look at the contents of these 1,500 responsa, I actually tested quite, 15 to 20% of them to see where these conversations originally came from. So again, I haven't tested them all, but I would say a good portion of them are age-old questions that were asked to earlier scholars within this kind of literalist, or we'll call it the muhaddithun, like the transmission, the hadith transmitter tradition. So it's pretty obvious, and there's been a lot of, I wrote about it in my dissertation, the exact places that these come from. It came from teachers like al-Thawri or other muhaddithun, the hadith transmitters. So, there's no real way to know whether something still has bearing in social reality unless you do the research and contextualize it, which I think can be done. It's just something I didn't do. I think that any given responsum could be contextualized to show perhaps an anecdote that was that informs the law, or comments on the law, or informs kind of the legal practices. So it can definitely be done, and there are a handful or two of actual social, really interesting social, socially real responsums. A responsa. So there is a way to tell the difference, to see which ones kind of come from the past and which ones are novel and new. It makes for an exciting study. Actually, this text makes for a very exciting study of social history. Just something I guess I couldn't accomplish.
Uri, I see that you have a question. Go ahead.
Well, it's not a question, it's just a remark, maybe just to pick up from where Chris left on the social image behind these responsa, whether we can actually reconstruct social scenarios through legal responsa. And that is a very open question. And I think that hasn't been resolved in modern scholarship yet. But one way to bypass that problem methodologically is not to ask whether these responses speak of real cases, whether there was a house that was shared by Jews and Muslims and the rain came through the chimney, but rather to say, well, this is what comes to mind to the legal scholars. This is how they imagine things. This is their pool of imageries that they can work with. And if that's the pool of imageries that they can work with, then this can suggest not the exact contours of the social reality, but the general setting. And this also goes back to some of the questions that were raised earlier about placing Ibn Hanbal's responsa and his material in a broader context. Definitely, it should be looked at along contemporary legal traditions and legal materials, not only Muslim, by the way. And if looked at in that way, then we can see there are threads running through the different legal traditions in terms of themes and tropes and so forth and so on. And then you can actually start working out what's going on there in terms of the social and religious realities, and say something, if at all, about the particularities of Ibn Hanbal's tradition.
Okay, thank you, Uri. Yes, Safir, go ahead.
I'm not an expert on Islamic law by any stretch of the imagination, but I do know the Jewish and Christian text, and you mentioned Jeremy Cohen's book. And what Jeremy, I think what works in his book is that he's dealing with the theologians, but at the same time he's saying, if we try and reconstruct something of the social picture of Jewish-Christian relations, we'll see that the theologians are dealing with one kind of questions, and people, or the other sources that we have, legal sources or even chronicles, are telling us a different story. So there is a tension between the image or the hermeneutic perception of the Jew and what sources that actually deal with social history are telling us. And I think this is what is missing here, and this is what Uriel and Ido and other people here have pointed out. You need the other pole of the social history to say what the theologians are doing, or what the responsa literature is doing is different than what we have, what is actually going on. And do you have the sources to do that, or are you thinking of doing something like that?
That's well-received feedback. Thank you so much for it. Yes, I'm in the process now. I haven't spoken about my dissertation since I finished it last year. But yeah, there's a lot. There are the sources there, and I'm compiling. I have, you know, files and files of anecdotes from adab works and poetry, and I'm just collecting. I've read through a lot of the, as Uriel mentioned, you know, the Christian sources as well. It's been some time since I looked at the Syriac sources, but you know, there is enough there, especially for historian or historical writing proper, and to really look at these different images. And I'm very excited to move forward and away from the ideas that I've spoken about here, not because I don't think they're viable, but for the same reasons that all the questions that are being brought up. I think it's all extremely useful feedback, and I really do appreciate it. It does need it.
Yeah, I don't think you need to move back from it. I think it needs, when you look at Jeremy's book, then it's about theology. It's about what theologians think. Yeah. But he has this different context to make it, to make the argument that they are not talking about what's actually going on. So you don't need to write two books, but you need to have the context to make your own argument.
Thank you.
Okay, so do we have another question, or can we conclude the meeting? Okay, so yes, Sarina, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just going back to Zafrir. Zafrir, do you mean that to write in intellectual history, you need the social context in some ways?
Only no. If you're making an argument that the intellectual history has a different way of working than the social one. If you're making if you only want to talk about intellectuals, it's all good.
Right.
But if you want to say that the intellectuals are constructing something different than the actual social relationships that are going on in the same time and place, then you need to make an argument about the social relations to some degree.
I get it. Yeah.
But there is another point to be made here, Zafrir. I'm not sure that what Chris is trying to do, and Chris can correct me if I'm wrong, is to consider Ibn Ḥanbal as a theologian here, but rather what he's trying to do is read his legal materials as literature, reading into it as as codes for hidden assumptions about the various communities and individuals he's referring to. This is not a theological analysis so much as it is a literary analysis, and he's trying to detect meanings and you know, premises at the base of the language that he's analyzing.
And
on the one hand,
I have no problem with that. I think that's absolutely fine.
So that's not Jeremy Cohen's project. You're right about that. That's not Jeremy Cohen's project. That's true. But the actual act of ascribing hidden meanings to explicit phrases or expressions is, in a way, is kind of similar to what Cohen did, in the sense that he sees here an added value to the direct contents of the text. It's not a theological analysis, it's a literary analysis, and that's something that should be stressed. There was another thing there that I wanted to point out, though, but I forgot, so I guess it doesn't really matter. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I think we can conclude now. We're running out of time. We actually ran out of time. So thank you very much, Chris, for this fascinating lecture and for allowing us to have this discussion. Thank you, everybody, for participating.